Senator Sims.
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to just take you back to some of the questions earlier we dealt with around resourcing. And you indicated that you've had an increase in resources under the previous government and also under this government. How well placed would you be to deal with an influx in complaints should that occur?
Well, I mean, obviously, if there's suddenly some factor that leads to an increase, and that's what actually happened to us last year with those vet fee help issues, that there were a core of providers that we looked at, about which there were a lot of complaints. It does, an event like that does affect your ability to do everything else. So obviously we prioritise against what are the highest risks at the time, and we focus heavily on the areas where the complaints raised with us, or whether we get intelligence from the department or other people about issues. Also we do check the media if some things break in there that lead us to go and have a look at somebody. But what we're trying to do is we've taken a number of steps to not do transactional kind of regulatory work that doesn't lead us to identifying the harms and the risks.
Yes.
So, for example, we were doing financial viability assessments of every re-registering organisation, whether there'd been any issue raised about their financial viability or not. And we found, after doing about 1,200 of those, that there were only one or two cases where we found real problems, and they were problems that were identified in the audit in any case. So we stopped doing things like that and started putting our resources more into looking at these issues where the smoke is being uncovered.
Yeah, so if there was a change in government policy, for instance, that suddenly led to a spike in these kind of complaints, you would struggle with current resources to be able to manage that.
Well, no, it's hard to talk about it in the abstract.
I know, it's a hypothetical.
But basically what we do is we reassess our resource usage and apply it to the highest priority issues. And we're doing a lot of work to develop our risk-based approach. So we use that to identify what complaints or block of complaints we're going to put the most resources into looking at. And we assess what are the biggest harms here. Some complaints are of much more minor matters, or some of them may be by employees about their employer and should be dealt with in other places because they're industrial relations issues.
You'd focus your resource. You'd have to have a sort of a rationalisation of your resources.
So we do attempt to use our resources in the most effective way, given the risks that we're confronting. So I mean. I'm sure if you asked all my staff, they would tell you that we could always do with more resources. But we have managed to do a massive amount of regulatory scrutiny with the resources we have, and as I say, they have been enhanced on a couple of occasions since we...
But you could certainly do with more, from what you're saying.
I'm not really saying we need more resources. I'm saying it'd be better if the providers did what they were supposed to do.
Yes.
But they don't all.
I think we can all agree on that.
And we do deploy. I think we do deploy our resources quite effectively around the issues of most concern.
That's fine. Thank you, Mr. Robinson. Minister, do you feel satisfied that there's appropriate resources being attributed to ASQA to deal with a phenomenon like, say, the government's plans to deregulate the TAFE sector and the influx of complaints that would result from something like that? I mean, are you satisfied that you've got the resources in place to deal with that?
Senator, I don't accept that the government has plans to deregulate the TAFE sector, quote unquote.
I read it in the paper. It wasn't an accurate
Well, we've been through a few instances of things you read in the paper today, Senator.
So the government doesn't have any plans to deregulate the TAFE sector?
Is the government in control of the TAFE sector?
Well, no, Senator Mackenzie, the government does not control the TAFE sector per se. The government does believe that competition within the vet sector, where well regulated and supported, can improve student choice and student outcomes and lower the costs ultimately to taxpayers. And that's consistent with the national partnership agreement that states and territories entered into with the previous government to.
So you do want to deregulate
to have
the
such
TAFE sector.
contestability of choice for students. To your substantive question of do I believe that appropriate resources are available for regulation? Yes, I do. The government, as you've heard, increased that resource load and level to ASQA by some $68 million only a couple of years ago now, I guess.
But Minister, with the respect we've just heard from the department that, you know, should a phenomenon...
And I should say the government also increased the resources available to the department in relation to their vet fee help compliance activities last year.
But Minister, we've just heard from the department that, or from ASQA, that should a phenomenon present where we see an influx of complaints, that they would have to rationalise their operations and, you know, start to focus on...
That is a hypothetical situation.
Well, not really a
Senator
hypothetical, given the agenda that you've just outlined in terms of deregulation.
No,
I mean, surely you would concede...
Senator Sims, I hate to break it to you, but increased contestability in the vet sector has been something that's been occurring over a number of years. I don't think we're about to see a sudden outbreak of issues associated with that. There have been issues. Absolutely, those issues relate to indeed poor regulation and the poor application of that regulation in many, many instances, and that's been very unfortunate and provided lessons that need to be learnt, both for state and territory jurisdictions and the Commonwealth. But no, I'm not anticipating a sudden upswing in complaints. If anything, I hope the fact that many efforts have been and continue to be made to try to address some of the problems that have been in the vet sector mean that we might see a downturn in complaints in the years to come.
So you don't concede that this shift towards private providers has been what's created the problems within the sector?
You know, Senator, when essentially TAFE was the only provider, there were plenty of complaints of different natures about the cost and effectiveness and adequacy and availability of training. And of course, we essentially have always had many private providers. I'd encourage you to have a look at the data released by NCVER last year, which I think shows that the part of the vet market that has the greatest employment outcomes and some of the greatest student satisfaction outcomes is the fee-for-service market. Largely private providers with no public funding involved. Now, there are also very good outcomes from TAFE in many instances, very good outcomes from some private providers in receipt of public subsidies. And there are some problems that have occurred that we need to ensure never happen again.
But with respect, Minister, surely you must concede that the shift towards this private model is what's brought about this crisis. And now you're talking about doing it with the TAFE sector, but there's been no additional resources being allocated to this department to deal with the inevitable increase in complaints.
Senator, TAFEs have been some of the biggest if we're talking about the vet fee help scheme in particular, TAFEs have been very big beneficiaries of the vet fee help scheme. Off the top of my head, I can recall that New South Wales TAFE went from receiving, I think, $90 million of revenue in one year to $190 million of revenue in another year.
All right, look,
states have perhaps engaged in a little cost shifting along the way in that activity.
The point that I'm making is that, you know, if you were to change the arrangements with respect to funding for TAFE or to pursue that endeavour, that would have an impact potentially on the number of complaints that would be received by an organisation like ASQA. Doesn't sound like you accept that.
Well, let me deal with the resourcing question. We thought there was a need for increased resourcing around compliance activities, both for ASQA and the department in relation to vet fee help. As a result of that, the government acted and provided additional funding to both ASQA and the department, respectively. If at a future time the government believes that there is a need for additional funding and resourcing, then of course the government will consider that need at that time. Equally, I hope that we do succeed in ensuring good practice, good behaviour, and that maybe at some stage down the track there might be savings that could be made in terms of some of the costs associated with responding to some of these issues.
You don't have any plans that accompany your plans for the TAFE sector?
And Senator Sims, you keep suggesting there are new plans for the TAFE sector. There are not, at this point in time, any particular new plans for the TAFE sector. The situation that I've outlined is a situation that applies in a national partnership agreement signed several years ago under the previous government.
All right, thank you. I don't have any more questions on this.
Thank you.